time that Pat Robertson and others began articulating a new political religion, one that was a radical break from traditional American fundamentalism and American evangelicalism. This tradition talked about the assumption of political power. It used a verse from Genesis about dominion, that Christians had been given dominion by God to control America and ultimately to create a global Christian empire. At the time, it was hard to take such fantastic rhetoric by Adams seriously. But Adams warned us against our intellectual snobbery that oftentimes allowed us to dismiss these characters as buffoonish. He told us that the Nazis were not going to return or reincarnate in America with swastikas and brown shirts, but that their ideological inheritors had found a mask for fascism in the pages of the Bible and by co-opting the language and iconography of American patriotism. Adams was not a person to use the word fascist lightly. He had been in Germany in 1935, in 1936, where he had worked with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller in the underground confessing church, and he was eventually detained by the Gestapo and forced to leave the country. But it was an experience that marked him deeply, and he was, of course, sensitive in ways that we were not to the elements that go into making up movements that at their core are totalitarian and seek in the name of a utopian exclusivity of the right to control a country. I left shortly after this for El Salvador. I was pretty much out of the country for 2 decades. So that distance allowed me to come back 2 decades later. And the difference between where these figures were when I left and where they had come to now when I returned was, of course, quite striking, because it may have been a gradual process, but for somebody juxtaposing American society in 1983 and American society in the year 2000, the differences, of course, were vast. These figures had moved from the fringes of American society, from the very margins of American society, into the mainstream. They counted, according to groups like Eagle Forum, Family Resource Council, I think 186 members of the House of Representatives, this is before the 2006 elections, had between 80 to 100% approval rating by these hard-right radical Christian groups. There were 45 senators who approved this rating. President Bush had begun handing hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to these groups. He had destroyed federal agencies that dealt with science, whether it was in areas of global warming, whether it was areas of reproductive health, whether it was AIDS research, and the distance that these people had traveled in the span of 2 decades was so stark that, and Adams, of course, warning came back to me, that I decided to set out and spend what ended up being 2 years following this movement, and I traveled all over the country, from megachurches to pro-life rallies to I spent a week with D. James Kennedy at Coral Ridge taking his course called Evangelism Explosion, which certifies me to carry out 20-minute conversions, so we can do that after the... To what? In D. James Kennedy calls it recruitment. It's the word that he uses. It's not simply conversion, it's recruitment into a movement. One of the great things about being a reporter is that oftentimes you carry assumptions into stories that are shattered. And I often find that, is sometimes what separates, good reporters from academics who can write their treatises without ever having anything impinge upon their assumptions. And I carried assumptions into this work that were wrong. And I'll share with you the first one. I I have such a deep distaste for the ideology of the movement that I was honestly prepared to dislike a lot of the people within it. And I have to say that didn't happen. In fact, the stories that I heard from, I'm talking about the followers of this movement, the people who send money, love offerings into TBN, to Paul and Jan Crouch, or money to James Dobson, or any of these figures, were so earnest and often well-meaning. And when I interviewed them, the stories of their lives were so heartbreaking. I didn't put it in the book, but repeatedly I would interview women within the movement, and for instance at a pro-life weekend. And one of the fascinating things, by the way, about a lot of the radical or most committed members of the pro-life movement, I found with women, is that not only had they had abortions, many of them have had multiple abortions. And the way the movement quite effectively manipulates their shame and their guilt, I found to be deeply cruel. They will take them off on weekends. I think it's called Rachel's Vineyard. And they give them dolls. And they tell them these are the children that they have murdered. And they must carry these dolls with them for the entire weekend and sleep with the dolls and clothe them. And at the end of the weekend, and these are women already struggling. You know, abortion is probably one of many things they're struggling with. They must offer up their children that they have killed to God and beg for forgiveness and commit themselves to fighting what is termed the culture of death. These stories, when you hear them, are so overpowering and so sad that it became very hard for me to dislike almost anyone. I'm talking about the followers, not the leaders. I find people like James Dobson, I find him a frightening and very dangerous figure. But the followers themselves have been manipulated and used in, I think, an extremely callous and heartless manner. And it was listening to these stories that pushed me back to some of the people like Fritz Stern or Karl Popper or Hannah Arendt, who tried to make sense of how a civilization like Germany, a civilization that produced Goethe to Beethoven, could end up carrying out the horror that it unleashed under the Nazi regime. And one of the books that I think helped me grasp what was going on in the Christian right was a book by Fritz Stern called The Politics of Cultural Despair. And Stern, when he himself was a Jewish refugee, he left in the late 1930s as a young boy. I ended up actually reading the book and spending a lot of time with Fritz. He was an amazingly thoughtful man, and has also spoken out, by the way, against the Christian right in terms that have shocked a lot of people. And all of his academic work was pre-1933, before the Nazis actually took power. And in the book, The Politics of Cultural Despair, he targets what he sees as personal and economic despair as being the engine that allowed people to eventually become sucked into this totalitarian, this fanaticism, this movement. He said to me, in Germany, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a yearning for fascism before the word fascism was invented. And that was extremely instructive to me, because I think that what's happened in the United States does bear many similarities to the breakdown of society in Germany or the breakdown of society in Yugoslavia. I covered the war in Yugoslavia for 3 years. Many people talk about the war in Yugoslavia as being caused by ancient ethnic hatreds. The war in Yugoslavia was caused not by ancient ethnic hatreds, but by the economic collapse of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was the country in Eastern Europe best equipped to enter Europe. And it even had within its ranks one of the great East European dissidents, certainly Václav Havel's equal, and that was Milovan Djilas. But of course, the mutation of the society had them turn to Slobodan Milosevic, who Djilas wrote about the inheritors of this and called them moral pygmies. And I found